we tend to watch these growth trends a little bit less intensely. However, there is one era that developmental psychologists pay a lot of attention to, and that is the onset of puberty. Outside of infancy, puberty and young adolescence is the time where we grow the fastest. We definitely grow the most in infancy. We double our weight really quickly. But outside of young infancy, the quickest time we grow in our life is puberty. So this is another time in our life where things like nutrition is especially important and sleep is especially important. Now in the last graphs I showed you the absolute weight and the absolute height. But these graphs on this slide are now showing the relative gain in both height and weight. So let's look at them. In this first chart, we're looking at the relative gain in height for both boys and girls. And we can see that in infancy, they are gaining the most in terms of height. They're doubling their length and doubling their height pretty quickly. Then around age 4, that plateaus. Kids are not growing as much each year. They're more stable. However, we can see roughly around age 11 for girls and then roughly around age 13 for boys, there's a spike in terms of how much they gain towards their height. And then of course it completely stops around age 17 for girls, and the curve didn't stop here for boys, but that's when they stopped measuring it. And so this is the idea that we gain rapidly in terms of our height in those years. But what's also going on is our gain in our weight. And so it's important to understand that before the big spikes in our height, we also have to gain in terms of our weight. That it's very normative that right before the onset of puberty, girls get a very large spike in their weight, that they put on a lot of body fat. This helps to prepare them for puberty. Boys tend to also put on a lot of weight, but it tends to less so be in fat and more so be in muscle gain. But as you can see here, they're not putting on a lot of weight in childhood, a little bit from time to time, but nothing compared to these massive spikes in weight gain at the onset of puberty. And so what is puberty all about? I mean, it's the time where we have to start watching our skincare, wearing deodorant, but there's two major events that we tend to pay attention to the most. And for girls, this is menarche. Menarche is the onset of the first menstrual cycle. And although this can change over time and from culture to culture, the last few decades in Canada, it's on average started at around 11 and a half years of age. Some girls can start as young as 9 and some girls can start as late as 16, but the average tends to be around 11 and a half years. This is very different from semenarche in boys, which often occurs as their first wet dream, and it's the first release of semen from them. And this on average happens around 13 and a half years of age, though again, there is a very wide range of what's typical and what's healthy. We're also paying attention to where the height tends to even out at the end of puberty, so at the end of adolescence, and we find that when fully grown, women in Canada tend to be an average height of 5'4", versus men in Canada tend to be an average height of 5'9". Now again, these are averages that change over history and across cultures, but those are the Canadian norms that we currently have. So after adolescence, we're done growing, right? Well, not quite. Although at the end of adolescence we know where our final height will be, our weight continues to fluctuate through much of our adulthood. In fact, most people find that they gain a lot of weight in their 20s and 30s and settle into a relatively stable adult weight. And since the idea that an 18-year-old might be their full height, but they tend to be a lot slimmer than what they will be over the duration of their adulthood, and that adult weight gain is a very normal thing. However, I want to point out that in both these charts, it looks like there is a weight loss going on after 50. What might be occurring here is that the average weight after 50 is not taking into account those who were very obese. Maybe they've passed away. After age 50, we know that substantially overweight individuals tend to have a shortened lifespan. So when we're looking at age 80 now, we're seeing people that are of a lower weight, and it might be because longevity is associated with weight. There's also two major milestones that happen later on in our adulthood, known as menopause and andropause, that developmental psychologists are interested in because it can impact our psychological well-being. For instance, menopause is the idea that a person who menstruates has now stopped menstruating. This can happen very briefly or it can happen very slowly over a decade. This could happen as young as a person's 40s or as late as their early 60s. And what often happens in this is they have irregular periods and then it stops. Now the reason why this is interesting to psychologists is because this is associated with a decrease in estrogen. And estrogen has been associated with lots of really interesting psychological phenomena. For instance, the reduction in these feminine hormones results in a reduction in one's interest in fulfilling and maintaining relationships. We find at this age, at menopause, people tend to become more abrupt and more blunt in their relationships and less interested in facilitating and doing the emotional labor to keep a relationship going. There's also been some indicators that estrogen is a protective factor against schizophrenia. And although schizophrenia tends to be diagnosed more in men and boys in adolescence and young adulthood, schizophrenia tends to be diagnosed more in women during midlife, particularly in their 40s or 50s. And it seems to be that with the decrease in feminine hormones, which were previously protective against schizophrenia, some women who are biologically predisposed for symptoms of schizophrenia may develop those symptoms at that point in their life. Now, another phenomenon we need to talk about is andropause. This is less researched than menopause, and this happens to people who produce a lot of testosterone. Testosterone tends to peak around age 18 and decrease throughout adulthood, but particularly in the 50s and 40s, the production of testosterone in men rapidly trails off and it decreases quite dramatically. This results in some sexual phenomena, such as experiencing erectile dysfunction, but it's also associated with marked emotional changes. We find when a person really drops in terms of their testosterone production, they become less dominant, less competitive, less angry. So just as a person experiencing menopause might be becoming less interested in fulfilling relationships and doing the emotional labor, a person experiencing andropause might become more interested in that, might become more sentimental, more gentle, less hostile. And so I always like to picture the heterosexual couple who is almost reaching a complementary point in their midlife.